See such a good, all right. It's great to see such a good turnout. Welcome, everybody. This is our 7th lecture in the Maya Living Legacy series. And I am also reminded that it's the last one of this series for the semester. So I'll let you know about upcoming talks. We'll be organizing quite a few of these talks for the spring. And so please just pay attention to announcements you're getting. We're going to continue with this. It's been really an exciting project. And this is also a joint event with our Archeology Brown Bag series. So we're delighted to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Ken Seligson, who's an archaeologist and an associate professor at California State University, Dominguez Hills. And I will say a few more words of introduction about Dr. Seligson in a moment. But before we get started, I just would like to share our land acknowledgement statement. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, we respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. And then before we begin, I'd also like to thank the collaborators and sponsors that made this lecture series possible. Professor Kata Belin, who's here today, spearheaded this interdepartmental effort and has been our lead organizer on this project. Addison Nace, who's also here, works on the logistical aspects to ensure that these events go very smoothly, and we appreciate her for doing that. Support for this project comes from the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, the Holt Center, the Center for Culture, History, and the Environment, and many individual departments, which are listed on the poster on your screen, including anthropology. Our speaker today is Dr. Ken Seligson, who's a familiar face for many of us in the anthropology program as he completed his PhD here in 2016. We know him not only as a dedicated and productive researcher, but also as a valued friend and colleague, and we're thrilled to welcome him back to tell us about his current projects and share his expertise with us. After earning his PhD, Dr. Seligson joined the faculty at Cal State and has continued to build a strong program of field research, focusing on human-environmental relationships, particularly among the pre-Hispanic Maya. He's a prolific writer and has published his research in several academic journals, including Ancient Mesoamerica and Latin American Antiquity, in addition to producing work that's illustrated and accessible to popular audiences and to students. He has a recent book out with Oxford University Press titled The Maya and Climate Change, in which he departs from a conventional focus on societal collapse to examine longevity, resilience, flexibility, and the strategic adaptations of the Maya to their changing environmental circumstances. The title of his talk today is In the Shadow of Giants, the earliest Ballcourt sites in the Puuc region of the northern Maya lowlands. So let's give a warm welcome, perhaps with our applause reactions, to Dr. Seligson.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, Kata and Addison, for inviting me to participate in this. It's just an amazing opportunity any chance I get to speak with an audience at UW. So thank you all for tuning in. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names in the participants list. So yeah, today, as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about my very recent research. So none of this has been published yet. This is all over the last 2 years. I want to share some of what we're working on with you all in regard to the era of transition to settled agricultural life in the region where I work in northern Yucatan called the Puuc region. But before that, I'd like to mention that I got my start in field work in Yucatan thanks to a Tinker Knave summer grant from LASIS and also a Weinstein Award from the anthropology department. Allowed me to go down there to do my preliminary dissertation work before I was even getting going on studying lime production. And just really always remember my time in Madison very fondly. You might see some faces you recognize, maybe some you don't up there. But it was just an amazing time in Madison while I was there. And again, it's always great to be able to speak with Madison folks. So thank you all for tuning in today. And so, yeah, from that first start in 2010 at this specific site called Puuc in the Puuc region of northern Yucatan, I've been going down there every year, developing new projects, working on new things. And so now I wanted to share what we've been working on, my team and I, these last couple of years. So after a brief introduction to the study area, I'm going to focus on the pre-classic period, which is this era that we start to see the transition to settled life and larger sites, and then focus on the two study sites where my project has been focusing, Paso del Macho and Chak. So a lot of you are coming in right now from Madison. I'm coming to you live right now from Southern California, Los Angeles County. And I'm going to be focusing, of course, on southeastern Mesoamerica, the Maya region, specifically the northern Maya lowlands. So if we zoom in here on a satellite map of northern Yucatan, you can kind of see in this topographic image an outline of the remains of the Chicxulub crater, where the meteor impacted 66 million years ago. You can see it on some satellite images because there is a ring of cenotes or sinkholes around the exterior of the crater, not so much in the interior. You can see that big white splotch, though. That is the modern capital of Yucatan, Merida. But just a little bit south of there is where I work. You have some modern cities that you might recognize the names. They're currently the major nodes of the Tren Maya project. And of course, there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of archaeological sites scattered between all of these modern villages and cities, including a more very recently registered, identified by archaeologists site called Valeriana, which you may have heard about if you are on the same kind of news feeds that I am. I don't think they're giving Luke enough credit, saying that he accidentally identified this site, as he was purposely looking for archaeological sites in this LiDAR data. But of course, you've seen this kind of headline making the rounds recently. I'll talk a little bit about LiDAR today as well. I know Dr. Ford spoke about LiDAR in her talk as well to kick off the series back in September. But our project is based out of the modern town of Oshkutska, which is right on the edge of the Puuc region. And the two small sites that I'll be focusing on in particular are Xanab, Chak, and Paso del Macho up in the Bolonchen district of the Puuc region. So we're based in Oshkutskab. Osh means three, Kut is turkey, and Kab is honey or tobacco in Yucatec Mayan. Cram those together, and you've got a colloquialism for a marketplace. And there has been a marketplace in Oshkutskab for centuries, if not millennia. And so you can pretty much get anything you want there. Turkeys, honey, tobacco. Today, very well known for citrus, actually. And in the last couple of years, they've glorified it and put in a Instagram-worthy town sign and all that kind of great stuff. But we are lucky, fortunate to have a whole research compound set up there called the Millsaps Puuc Archaeological Research Center. My colleague at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi, George Bay, has put together this infrastructure over decades, and I've been able to be a part of it since 2010. And just an amazing opportunity to work with our local colleagues down there and bring students down to get some experience, cross-cultural experience, and learn more about the ancient Maya sites that we have there. So Oshkutskab is located just on the edge of this region called the Puuc. Puuc means hill in Yucatec Mayan. So unlike a lot of the other parts of Yucatan, which are relatively flat, the Puuc region has thousands of low hills that have eroded over millions of years, leaving behind very fertile soils, which would make it a very attractive place for settlers to come and farm. However, on the flip side, there is absolutely no surface water to speak of, no lakes, no rivers, no streams, and there are hardly any cenotes. There are maybe one or two or a handful of caves that reach down to the water table because this area is slightly elevated. So you really had no access to groundwater at all during the pre-Hispanic period. People living in the Puuc region had to develop ways to capture and store rainwater, which would only fall for about half of the year, to be able to survive there year-round. So this transition from passing through on a seasonal basis to staying there year-round would have been a major transition. People would have had to overcome these environmental challenges to do so. And we've known for a long time that the Puuc region experienced a demographic and construction boom during what we call the late or terminal classic period, roughly 700 to 950 CE. And for a long time, it was thought that that is really when we see people colonize or settle in the Puuc for the first time, and that the northern lowlands were more of a backwater in comparison to what was going on farther south around places like Tikal and Caracol. But we've known now for a few decades, 20, 30 years, that there was a lot going on in the northern lowlands prior to the late classic. The question remains, though, when were folks initially settling in large numbers in this region, which would have been a very challenging environment to do so. So the Puuc region sticks up kind of like a shark fin in the center part of the northern Yucatan, roughly split into two areas. You have the Valley of Santa Elena, where you have large sites developing like Uxmal. And then to the south of this, you have the real hill district, the Bolonchen district, where you have these thousands of low hills interspersed by planadas or flat areas where you have a lot of fertile, deep soil. So this is what a lot of the Bolonchen district looks like today. And so you're looking right now at the center of the site of Kiwik, and you can't see anything. This is a heavily forested environment. Populations in the Puuc region today are much lower than they were about 1,000 years ago during the terminal classic period. But this is where LiDAR really comes into play for us in the Puuc area. As you see in other parts of the Maya lowlands and really around the world, LiDAR is changing how we do settlement studies in archaeology today. So LiDAR now is used as its own word, but it started as an acronym for light detection and ranging. Basically, you send down 150,000, now it's like 500,000 points per second. They bounce off the ground or whatever feature there is there, back up to the sensor, and you get a readout of what you got below there. In a heavily forested environment like this, 99.99% of those points are going to hit the top of trees, bounce back up to the sensor, and you get a readout of what the top of the forest looks like. However, if you've been in a dense forest and you look up, you can see the sky in tiny holes between the leaves and the branches. And it's through those tiny holes that maybe 5 or 10 points get down to the forest floor per meter and back up to the sensor. And that is enough to stitch together those points to get a digital readout of what the forest floor looks like below the vegetation. So if we look at the northeastern side of the site of Puuc Region, this is a Google satellite image, Google Earth image, and you can see forest, you can see a recently planted milpa, you can see an orchard in the northwest corner. Here are those 99.99% of points showing you the outline of those trees and the milpa and the orchard. So if we remove the vegetation points and show only what's left behind, stitching together the points that got through the leaves to the forest floor, this is what is actually there in the northeast suburb of Puuc Region. We're talking about dozens of residential platforms, a small pyramid, a marketplace area. This structure all the way on the left side of the image is about 110 feet long and has 12 rooms. So you can see how much LiDAR is changing how we do settlement archaeology. Mapping this on the ground, walking back and forth across the forest floor would have taken months, if not years, to accurately get a depiction of what this site looks like. This flyover from a low-flying plane happens in one day. Processing takes a couple of weeks or months, and then you have this image. So this is really changing how we understand where sites are located and how they relate to their environments. However, what you're seeing here is the final version of the settlement of this area. This is what is on the surface today. And as we know, people living in the Maya area have been constructing over earlier settlements for thousands of years. So we're only seeing the final version of these archaeological sites. So this is an issue that's going to come up in the talk today. But my colleagues and I have been fortunate enough to get 400 square kilometers of LiDAR data in the Eastern Puuc since 2017. This has really helped us to develop new models for what was going on here. But before we get into this data specifically, I want to zoom out for just a second to help familiarize those of you who are not too focused on Maya archaeology, what I'm going to be talking about timeline-wise. Because a lot of what we see out there in terms of Maya archaeology tends to focus on the classic period, which is 700 to 950 CE. So we're only seeing the final version of these archaeological sites. So this is an issue that's going to come up in the talk today. But my colleagues and I have been fortunate enough to get 400 square kilometers of LiDAR data in the Eastern Puuc since 2017. This has really helped us to develop new models for what was going on here. Before we get into this data specifically, I want to zoom out for just a second to help familiarize those of you who are not too focused on Maya archaeology, what I'm going to be talking about timeline-wise. Because a lot of what we see out there in terms of Maya archaeology tends to focus on the classic period, which is well known to the popular imagination. A lot of the focus on the ancient Maya hones in on this time period of roughly 800, 900 years. The start dates and end dates are variable depending on who you talk to. But a lot of the focus ends up being specifically on the late classic period, which is only a span of 250, 300 years, because that's when we see the height of the elaborate calendar system and intricate writing, beautiful polychrome ceramics, impressive sculpture, and of course, monumental architecture that is on the surface today. A lot of these developments came to a peak during the late classic period. However, we've known for a long time that this classic period fluorescence came after hundreds, if not thousands of years of prior development. When we can first say these settlements should be considered Maya is up for debate because, of course, the whole idea of Maya identity comes through the area later. But we see significant and continuous development dating back to what we call the pre-classic period or even the earlier archaic period, thousands of years before the classic period. So we've known about sites with civic architecture in Cuello in northern Belize, for instance, Cebal in Guatemala, Caminaljuyu near Guatemala City in the highlands. These villages were developing just about the beginning of the middle pre-classic period or end of the early pre-classic period around 1900 BCE. And there were dozens of these sites throughout the Maya area at that time. So we've known this for a long time, but the thinking until the last couple of decades was that the heartland of early Maya civilization really got going in an area called the Mirador Basin on the border between northern Guatemala and Campeche, Mexico. This is where we see some really large sites with massive architecture developing towards the end of the middle pre-classic period. So this map came out recently, another LiDAR map by Richard Hansen and colleagues. But we thought that around 600, maybe 500 BCE, we start to see these really large sites developing in this area, and that Maya civilization, as we came to know it, radiated out from here. So this was an absolutely massive site, El Mirador, that reached its peak during the late pre-classic period, roughly 500 BCE to 200 CE. I mean, it's a National Geographic reconstruction there in the top right, so we all know to take those with a grain of salt, but gives you an idea of the size of this site. And so this is what we were thinking for a long time. We see these smaller sites developing around the Maya area, but this is where we start to see that leap to really complex society, really, really large sites in this area around this time. Things shifted recently, 6 years ago, when Takeshi Inomata and colleagues perused some LiDAR data that was made available by the Mexican government along the Gulf Coast region of Mexico, and specifically in the state of Tabasco, in the Gulf Coast region. They looked at this site that from the aerial photographs, looks like just a natural hill. But with LiDAR, you peel back the vegetation and you see that this was, of course, a massive archaeological complex, the site that they came to know as Aguada Phoenix. And test excavations in that massive central platform that is almost a mile long dates it to around 1100 to 800 BCE, meaning people had to come together to build this massive complex. So not only did they identify Aguada Phoenix, but there were dozens of other sites with the same model of construction all throughout this Gulf area, spanning from the Olmec region to the west into the Maya lowlands to the east. Really changing our idea of what was going on in this late, early pre-classic, beginning of the middle pre-classic time period around 1000 BCE. And of course, what do ancient aliens enthusiasts see? They see a runway for spaceships, but of course, we're not going to get into that. But shifting to the north still, now we have this massive site developing on the western Maya area. We have large sites developing a little later, northern Guatemala. What's going on in the north? Projects over the last 10, 15 years in the northern lowlands, in this region specifically, have identified massive sites as well, dating to the early middle pre-classic period. So around 900, 800 BCE, you have sites like Xocnaque, just north of Oshkutskab. You have massive acropolis sites in the Valle de Santa Elena, Yashom, Muluc Sekel. These are massive acropolis sites on the order of what we were seeing at El Mirador. Not quite as large as like Guadalajara Phoenix in terms of that almost mile-long platform, but still a massive amount of time and effort and human power would have gone into building these human-made mountains. So these sites are being built at the edge of the Puuc region in the valley of Santa Elena, but what's going on a little bit to the south in the Bolonchen district? We do have a lot of sites developing in this region later on during the Classic period. If we look at a heat map of where population is located on the surface, so again, this is the last phase of habitation in the region towards the end of the Classic period, around 900 CE, we see sites popping up pretty much every 4 kilometers, 5 kilometers apart with pretty dense settlements. And there are platforms all throughout this region. And a lot of them are covering earlier settlements. People tended to build in the same place over.
So the first time out, Shayla like landed on her hands and knees, like.
If you could mute yourself, thank you.
So we see that there are sites everywhere, and we see what's on the surface, and we can do test excavations to see what's below some of these sites. And excavations in places like Labna and Huntichmul and Kiwik have shown that there were pre-classic antecedents. But another thing that the LiDAR data is showing us is that in between these large classic period settlements, there happened to be, and sorry about this for any motion sickness, this is the peak of my PowerPoint prowess. We do have a few sites that appear to date to the pre-classic period without any classic period overburden, as we'd call it, or later superimposition of construction from later periods. So there we have the large classic period site of Labna with a really nice palace. But just to the southwest and the northeast, we have these two very small clusters of architectural features that look in the LiDAR data like they do not date to the classic period. So let's zoom in on one of them right here. And let's enhance. There we go. This is the site we know as Paso del Macho. And just looking at it in the LiDAR data, my colleagues and I identified it as a possible pre-classic site just because of how the features look that much more melted than you would see from the classic constructions. The classic period constructions are about 1,000 years old. If this site did date to the pre-classic, it would be over 2,000 years old. That much more time for the elements to erode the structures, collapse them outward. But more importantly, we identified this site as a possible pre-classic site because of those two parallel structures just to the east of this modern road that runs through the central plaza. Those two parallel structures are an ancient Ballcourt. And for some reason, we do not see Ballcourts at the classic period sites in the Puuc region. They appear to only be at pre-classic sites. So in the LiDAR data, you can see here this cluster of 9 structures in this central plaza, but then LiDAR only shows you so much. That's another limitation. Just walking back and forth across this valley, my colleague Evan Parker was able to identify 80 tiny residential mounds that are just a ring of rough stones showing where they would have held up a perishable structure, but this does not get picked up by the LiDAR data, even with a sub 1 meter resolution. So we do still have to combine the LiDAR with old-fashioned pedestrian survey to make sure that we get everything covered. So these smaller structures don't look like much in the archaeological record today. Again, just a cluster of stones. But you can see the rough remains of these outlines, and they appear to be built up on small stone platforms. And we found out why that was when I was just down in Yucatan this past week, and it was still raining for the rainy season. There was flooding everywhere. And these stone platforms raised these houses just above flood lines. But even at these tiny outlying house mounds, we found things like basalt hand axes. And there is no basalt to be spoken of anywhere in northern Yucatan. The most likely nearest place where residents would have been importing basalt from was the Tuxtla Mountains in Veracruz, hundreds of kilometers away. So this gave us an idea that these tiny sites are plugged into these far-ranging networks even in the early pre-classic period, because it did turn out that these house mounds and the site center date to the middle pre-classic period. So if we zoom in quickly on the center of Paso del Macho, my colleague Evan Parker did some excavations in the central plaza here. So he excavated down through what would have been this sacred plaza area and was surprised to find the remains of house mound outlines in the center of this plaza, showing that this was not always a civic center, that this was originally a small agricultural village that over time, over hundreds of years of occupation from roughly 900 BCE to about 400 BCE, developed into a civic area from the original village. And it looks like those residential houses, those residential mounds ended up spreading to the outside of the valley, and this central area became the public area, the civic ceremonial center. But he did triangulate the very center part of this central plaza, and excavating down identified a series of caches or offerings that were likely linked with the founding of this agricultural village around 900 BCE. In the very center of this site, he and the team uncovered this small ceramic vessel. Doesn't look great today, but considering it's almost 3,000 years old, not too shabby. What was really interesting about this vessel, though, was in the very center of it at the base, there was this figure, and then there were 4 other of the same figures around the rim. I thought it looked like a crab or a lobster, but these are in fact turtles. And we know that the turtle is very important. Any reptilian, amphibian creature is important because of the Maya conception of the world on the back of a large reptilian or amphibian creature living or placed in a large primordial sea. The earth is believed to be the ridged back of a crocodile or a turtle shell. And so here we have a turtle representing the center, the axis mundi, and we have these 4 turtles around the outside representing the 4 directions. And this is a conception of the world, a cosmogram, a model of the universe. And in the center of this rudimentary but really important bowl, the team identified these, which ended up being, when they're nice and cleaned up, 18 jade pendants, or 17 jade pendants and 1 other greenstone pendant, which again is just incredible to uncover here in Paso del Macho, the small agricultural village deep in the Bolan-Chen district, and this offering dating to 900 BCE, because jade only comes from one place in all of Mesoamerica, as far as we know, and that's southeastern Guatemala in the Motagua River Valley. And here these jade pieces are showing up in the north. And not only that, but the way that they're carved in this kind of spoon or clam shape, and the fact that there's a small etching in one of them actually links them to Olmec jade in the Gulf Coast region of Veracruz, suggesting that the jade was there first from southeastern Guatemala to Veracruz and then up here into northern Yucatan to be offered in this community founding ritual. They were buried there. Maybe 18 families who were representing the first families of this site came together and each sacrificed one of their precious family heirlooms to make a commitment to being there and founding this new community. So this is a pretty incredible find here. There's been some jade finds like this, buried at sites like Cebal in Guatemala, one other site in northern Yucatan, Chak, and these are considered these placemaking or founding rituals. But the fact that you're finding it at this very small site in Bolan-Chen district suggests that these sites were plugged into these far-ranging, wide networks, more so than we had previously thought, given how kind of hinterland vibes the area has today. So here's what the offering may have looked like when it was first buried. The ceramic vessel would have been in slightly better shape than it is now, but you can see this kind of recreation of the cosmos in this burial right here. So this was uncovered at Paso del Macho, but it's not the only site that we're looking at as part of this project, because just about 3.7 kilometers to the northeast is another small site that appears to have middle pre-classic vibes based on what we see in the LiDAR. So let's zoom in on there and let's enhance again. Good. So you'll see some similarities here just in this LiDAR image to what you were seeing at Paso del Macho. At this site, that we have dubbed Xanab Chak. The local guys that I work with from the town of Kankab unfortunately encountered a large wasp nest at the center platform there of a type of wasp called Xanab Chak, which is the shoe or the chancla of the rain god Chak, because it's pretty big. It looks like a small chancla. So yeah, so it got its name from that. And we started working their preliminary mapping in 2022. I was able to bring 4 students with me from Cal State Dominguez Hills. This is how happy they looked at the start of day 1. And then you see some pretty forced smiles by the end of day 1 there. They were not expecting the 110-degree heat, 99% humidity. But we were able to map the entire site center that year and discern some features that you're not able to see necessarily in the LiDAR. So here's the site center itself, including this large central platform, which is a lot larger than any of the platforms at Paso del Macho. And then you have on the northwest corner of this image, you can see those parallel structures, a Ballcourt. So just based on this alone and a trace amount of ceramics that were visible on the surface, we were able to hypothesize that this site too was a pre-classic site that for some reason or other was not built over during the classic period. And we were able to confirm this through test excavations in 2023. So I brought another group of students down with me that summer, Jose, Reese, Diana, and Alyssa. That's them again, beginning of day 1. And by the end, they were really feeling it as well, questioning their life choices. But we were able to excavate a few test pits that summer in the central plaza or central platform and in the Ballcourt. And just focusing in right now on the central platform excavations, I know a lot of folks in the room are not archaeologists, so I would just want to take you through what it's kind of like to go in there. We were really excavating this small test excavation to confirm whether the site did date to the pre-classic period. And we would be able to do that based on the ceramic sherds, the little pieces of ceramic fragments that we uncover, and potentially if we are lucky enough to uncover any carbon or other organic materials, those will be able to be dated potentially with radiocarbon dating. We did not find any charcoal, unfortunately, but we did find tons of ceramics that allowed us to confirm that this platform was indeed built during the middle pre-classic period. Just some photos give you an idea. The platform is about 40 meters long by 34 meters across and about 1.5 meters high, like maybe averages 5 or 6 feet high from the surrounding forest floor. So pretty massive construction for this site here. Bigger, we found out, than Paso del Macho for sure. And sitting atop this platform is a secondary platform along the eastern side with this big megalithic staircase, a megalithic referring to the size of the stones. What was interesting though, on top of this staircase is a room, a one-room structure that looks like it dates to the classic period. So it's not surprising that folks living at Labna, just to the west, and other classic period sites around here knew about this site that would have been considered an ancient site to them, 1,000 years old by the time they were living at Labna. And it's not surprising that some folks would have come here and tried to build on top, but it is surprising that the entire site was not built over, and they instead decided to build up at Labna and not here. We're not sure exactly why, but we are thankful for that because that allows us to look at this middle pre-classic site with very limited later intrusion. So we were excavating really just to determine the construction sequence of this platform. And of course, it was 110 degrees, so having a tarp was possibly the most critical tool we had just to allow us to go from 6:30 a.m. to around 12:30 p.m. After that, it was just too much. We had to head back to camp every day. But about 0.5 meter below the surface, digging through these middle pre-classic layers, we uncovered something unexpected. What appeared to be an offering, because you don't often find a whole ceramic vessel buried on its own. Usually you find little fragments that have been broken ahead of time and then were just thrown into the mix as fill to fill up space. But in this case, we had what appeared to be the majority, the major part of the whole vessel there. And then we noticed that one of the fragments of this vessel looked a little strange. It looked like a fish or something. Then we looked closer and we noticed that it had nalgas. And so if you zoom in there, it turns out it was a little figurine, and that's about as big a smile as I will give in the field. Never again. But this was a pretty surprising find for us. And if you clean it up a little bit, there you have the figurine of Chak. And it was very surprising to us because there have been no figurines identified from the middle preclassic period pretty much in all of northern Yucatan. There's these two tiny fragments from a site called Vista Alegre in northeastern Yucatan in the Yalao region. But aside from that, the middle preclassic figurine tradition that we see in Guatemala, Belize, other parts of Mexico appeared to be absent from northern Yucatan. And this begins to question that. So some pretty distinctive features of this figurine. It's remarkably well preserved considering we are preliminarily dating it to around 400 to 700 BCE, so 2,500 years old, missing only some tiny fragments. My colleague George Bay was able to put back together a couple of pieces that had broken off. But you can see it's a relatively androgynous figure holding a tecomate, which also is pretty unique among the figurine tradition around other parts of Mesoamerica during this time. There's a turban-style headdress. It sits really well on its own, pretty well-formed legs and arms. And the tecomate is pretty huge, helping to solidify the image, solidify the figurine itself, the structure of it, but also potentially being just about the right size for someone to stick an index finger in there in case there were any kind of pigment or anything else that they'd be able to pull out of there and perhaps use as part of a ceremony. But I'll just give you some more images of it. We're dating it preliminarily to that time period because it was in a middle preclassic platform, but also because it was buried below this dish, which is an Uchben incised dichrome dish, which dates to that time period, roughly 400 to 700 BCE, called the early Nabanche phase of pottery. And so this offering was buried, we believe, as part of the reconstruction of this platform during that time period after the initial platform was built up about 100 or 200 years earlier. They went back and augmented it during this time period and buried this offering, possibly as part of a reactivation ritual. But maybe one of the things that has caught your attention about the figurine is the face, the eyes in particular. So this was pretty confounding to us in the first place. Comparing the Xanab figurine with figurines from northern Guatemala, western Belize, central Mexico, Veracruz, Tlaxcala, Vista Alegre, and La Blanca on the Pacific Coast region of Guatemala. There's definitely some overlap in terms of the slightly uplifted left part of the upper lip, kind of the snarling image that we see in a lot of Gulf Coast figurines. The lips in general do overlap with some of the ones that we see in northern Guatemala. The turban-style headdress we see as far away as Tlatilco in central Mexico. But the eyes were what was really distinctive about it, at least for a while, because just looking at it at first glance, you're like, why does this figurine have 4 eyes? And I was looking for mentions of 4 eyes or double eyes anywhere else in these figurine traditions, and there were none of it. The Tlapacoya figurine you see there is the closest that I saw, but not exactly the same thing. But what's going on here is actually probably a little bit simpler than that. What's really throwing, or what was throwing me off at least, were the left eyes, which you see are slightly larger and aren't quite aligned with each other. But if we take the right eyes, the right holes, shift them over to the left side, you can get a better idea of what's actually going on here, which is a well-known tradition of these double punching techniques. These are actually supposed to be the whites of the eyes, the sclera framing a pupil. So you can get an idea here. We're not looking at 4 eyes, we're looking at 4 sclera and 2 pupils. So what was throwing me off was the fact that these left indentations are slightly misaligned and deeper. I was thinking that maybe there were 2 eyes and then there were other adornments, things that would have been fitted in there that have since eroded as maybe some kind of adornment on the temples. But what's more likely going on here again is that we're just looking at an interesting way to depict the eyes. And that makes a lot more sense, and that does fall more in line with the traditions that we see elsewhere. But because of the distinctive features of the figurine overall, holding the tecomate, and with the other specific combination of features, as of now, we are thinking that this was locally made, which would be very interesting because it would show that whoever made it was aware of all these other figurine traditions that may have even traveled somewhere else to get an idea of how to build these figurines or make them, but then actually made it locally. So we're working on some INAA analysis right now on the clay of the figurine to confirm whether it was made locally or somewhere else. And we'll hopefully find out about that very soon. But below the figurine level, we did find a scattering of a bunch of other pottery from earlier types of pottery vessels, including a shkunia unslipped bowl and part of a basin, and then a shattered keen orange red tecomate, which probably would have been very similar to the one that the figurine was holding in the later offering. So my colleague George Bay was able to fit back together parts of these vessels to give you an idea here, but these were from an earlier ceramic tradition. So they were probably smashed and then buried, already smashed, below the first iteration of this platform, directly on top of the gnarly bedrock of the Puuc. And that first version of the platform was built. Then a couple of generations later, the community got together and built over that original platform, made it bigger, reconsecrated the space, and buried that ceramic figurine in the center there. So over time, with all the trees that have grown on this platform, with roots going through, mixing things around, all the stones have gotten jumbled, but possibly the original platform would have looked more like this, with those offerings representing these different construction phases. So that's what happens in archaeology. We're trying to fit together this puzzle, this jigsaw, and we'll never see the front of the box to know if we were exactly correct. That's why we have to pull together all these different lines of evidence as much as we can to test our hypotheses. And so that was a really surprising and interesting find in the central part of the platform. We're hoping to rush to get a publication out soon. Not rush, but we're hoping to get a publication out soon so everyone can have more access to this figurine and perhaps make some linkages there that I was not able to find. But just to wrap up today, I wanted to mention quickly our excavations in the Ballcourt itself, which was also a very interesting series of investigations. So we were able to broaden our excavations this past summer thanks to a new NSF grant. And this summer, Eileen, Hector, and Tristan and Diana came down, and they already knew my shtick. They were prepared for the after day one photo. So that's them pretending to be all great with 115-degree weather this year. But we have these two Ballcourts at Chak and Paso del Macho. You might be familiar with some aspects of the ancient Mesoamerican ball game, known to the Aztecs or Nahuatl as Ulama. And there's many different versions. One of the Maya versions is called Puuc. You may have seen images of the Ballcourt at Copan in Honduras, or Tonina in Chiapas, or maybe the great Ballcourt of Chichen Itza, which we believe was not actually used to play the ball game. It was more of a processional route that was made to look like a Ballcourt. But of course, this is the one that influenced things like the road to El Dorado. But we do know a lot about the ancient ball game from the iconography in the Maya area, depictions on ceramic vessels. We even have recovered actual rubber balls. This one was offered as part of an offering at the Olmec site of El Manatí. It's about 3,000 years old, and it's preserved because it was completely submerged in water for that long. But pretty much just taking pure natural rubber, winding it around until you get a dense rubber ball. Sometimes we're talking 12, 15 pounds. And so if you can imagine a 12 or 15-pound lacrosse ball, you're not going to want to swing your appendages at that, no fingers or feet. You're going to be hitting it with your hips mainly, sometimes your shoulders possibly, with a lot of protective gear. Give you an idea of this little gift for you. But you have maybe these images of these ancient Maya Ballcourts in your mind. The ones from the pre-classic period, especially here in the Bolan Chen district, are nowhere near as glamorous. We can identify them as Ballcourts because of the parallel structures and the LiDAR. Evan's excavations in the Ballcourt at Paso del Macho uncovered this bench that was the front part of a sloping area, or this wall that was demarcating the beginning of a sloping bench, similar to what you would see in the later classic Ballcourts. So that's what we were expecting to find at Xanab Chak with our excavations there. But we found a little bit more of a complicated picture. Paso del Macho, it appeared that the Ballcourt was constructed really late during the site's occupation, maybe around 500 BCE, as an addition to that site. At Xanab Chak, we were finding a couple of different things. First of all, we found a pretty nice sascab floor. So sascab is a very soft kind of limestone. It can be pounded down into a powder, then really pounded hard and smooth to look almost like plaster. And this was, it turns out, the second floor of the Ballcourt. There was an earlier floor that was almost completely eroded because it had been exposed to the elements for that much longer. In between those two floors, though, was a ton of cheech. Cheech refers to the small pieces of limestone that was used as fill. And amidst this cheech fill were tons of ceramic sherds, some of them very well preserved, helping us date this construction phase to the late middle pre-classic period, around the same time that the figurine would have been interred in the central platform. In the eastern structure of the Xanab Chak Ballcourt, we identified two terraces, and then that kind of bench or ramp similar to the one that Evan had identified at Paso del Macho. So we have a slightly different structure here, and give you an idea of what we're dealing with when the rainy season starts, right around the beginning of our excavations. Apologies in advance, you can look away. If you're not a big fan of creepy crawlies, these tiny inchworms were coming down from the trees, and then as soon as they made it to the ground, they would start just wriggling around on the ground. So for about a week or so, this was a nice, fun addition to our excavations. We went from about 115 degrees at the beginning during the dry season. The rainy season started about halfway through our excavations. Then we were dealing with bugs. And honestly, after the season was over, I think I'd prefer the 115 degrees to the bugs. We'll see what happens next year, though. But excavating through part of that first floor that we identified, we found 5 steps leading up to the eastern structure. And these same 5 steps were found in the western structure as well. So if we sit on those steps in the western structure and look out towards the central playing alley of the Ballcourt, we were able to identify that final floor, which mainly disintegrated, the second floor, which was pretty well preserved, a third earlier floor that was also well preserved, a fourth floor below that, and then possibly here close to the western structure, a fifth floor that was a mix of dirt and some sascab. So we have at least 4 construction phases in this area showing how this area of the site developed over time. And so just zooming out here a bit in the central alley, one other thing I wanted to mention was that we have floor 2 here. We have the steps of the eastern structure. We have the 3rd floor. We have the 4th floor. And then we found along the eastern edge of this patch, or the southern edge of this patch of the 4th floor, a line of stones that suggested there was some kind of feature in the middle of the Ballcourt playing alley, something that you don't normally see. Excavating through floor number 2 here in the bottom right part of this image, we found another surprise. Well, you see this hole pretty clearly in the floor there. The thing about that hole is we did not make that hole. You can see the outline of this hole actually is the outline of an ancient hole that ancient excavators dug through this second floor of the Ballcourt and through the 3rd floor of the Ballcourt. And they were searching for something. So these were likely folks that were coming in from a classic period site like Labna, about 1,000 years or 800 years after Xanab Chak was depopulated. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They triangulated the center part of the Ballcourt, and they excavated down into it and removed whatever was there, leaving for us these 2 limestone stones two pieces of limestone, and that was it. But below that part of the Ballcourt floor that was intact, we did identify this small rectangular platform, which was a surprise to find in the middle of a Ballcourt playing alley. Unfortunately, the ancient excavators had dug through the center of this platform and recovered whatever they were looking for, which may have been resting directly on top of the bedrock there. But it was an interesting find to identify this moment in time when people had come through the site well before we did and recovered whatever they were looking for. Sometimes you have Ballcourt markers, sometimes you have offerings in the center of a Ballcourt. That's possibly what was going on here, but it helped us identify this as the center of the Ballcourt because they would have been coming to a Ballcourt that looked more like a Ballcourt than the disintegrated mounds that we have today. So if we zoom out from these excavations, this is what they ended up looking like for us over the course of our preliminary excavation in 2023, and then our larger excavation units this past summer. So if we take these snippets of the Ballcourt and extrapolate them outwards, we have this final Ballcourt that would have been this long playing alley with 5 steps on either side and terraces. In the western structure, those terraces had disintegrated completely, and we actually identified the earlier version of the Ballcourt on that side. So the eastern Ballcourt excavations, if we take away all the collapse and the fill that has blown onto there over hundreds of years, this is what the profile of the final version of the eastern structure would have looked like. So we can even remove the subfloors. And so this is what maybe those ancient excavators would have found from Lubna when they came here 500, 800 years after it was depopulated, and found the center of the Ballcourt and excavated down and recovered what they were looking for. The western structure, again, those terraces had long since crumbled, disintegrated, so we were actually able to identify the earlier version, probably associated with the second floor that we found. So this would have been more of a sloping bench, similar to the one that was identified at Paso del Macho. And we had identified an even earlier version in our 2023 excavation. So taking all this data together, it looks like this area was not always a Ballcourt. They would not have put a raised platform in the center of a playing alley. So this was likely another area of the site that later on, maybe around 700 BCE, when they built up the central platform more, they decided to also change the Ballcourt alley a little more. And so then they built this Ballcourt on top of that platform. Then they augmented it again. And then the final version would have had these terraces. So we can see this transformation of the space over time as this small agricultural village transformed into more of a destination center and was building up this public architecture, perhaps to draw people from other small villages to come live at Xanab Chak. But basically, these excavations that we've been doing at these small pre-classic sites in the Puuc region over the last couple of years show that this map of pre-classic sites that are now known and registered and published throughout the Maya lowlands are just a small portion of the picture. Even these 2 sites that we've been working at don't tell the whole story in our LiDAR zone. There are dozens of other tiny sites that may date to the pre-classic period, and we know that a lot of the classic period sites are covering these earlier sites in that region. So if we zoom that out, and apologies to anyone who has trypophobia, fear of irregularly shaped holes or circles, but this is probably a more accurate image of what the Maya lowlands looked like during the pre-classic period. And of course, we've been working in the Maya area for 150 years as archaeologists, and there's still so much more to learn about what's going on there in these earliest time periods, especially. Sorry, I know that was a lot, but thank you all so much for tuning in. And I really look forward to any questions you have. And thanks again, everyone, for coming.
Thanks so much, Ken. That was a really fascinating talk, and you're doing such great work and so many details. We're learning so many new things as a result of your research in that region. So I'm sure that there are questions. There's already one question in the chat. And in case Francisco's still here, I don't think that he is, but I'll read the question. It has to do with the Maya and how it has affected archaeological sites in that area, or might affect our ability to know about these pre-classic Ballcourt sites and pre-classic agricultural villages. If you could speak to that for a moment.
Yeah, so we are, I guess, fortunate in our area that the Tren Maya did not come through the Puuc specifically. The line that went from Campeche to Merida skirted the western edge of the Puuc. They were going to build a little addition extension directly to Uxmal, which also would have avoided us. I don't think they ended up doing that. They're using buses. But yeah, we're fortunate in the sense that we know that the Tren Maya excavations or construction projects throughout the Yucatan have been destroying a lot of archaeological materials. It's been going way too quickly. They've been trying to do a 40-year project in 6 years. So protecting sites where they can, bringing in archaeologists obviously is part of the project, but really not giving the time and effort to preserving and learning about these sites as you would normally. So yeah, we're fortunate to not have to deal with that any of that where we're working locally, but some of my colleagues, my Mexican colleagues who work on this project, when we're not down there over the summer, they're obviously doing a lot of stuff for the National Institute of Anthropology and History, and so they were called to help around the area of Coba and the eastern Maya lowland or the eastern Yucatan, and they were doing what they could to help conserve and learn about these archaeological materials and features before the Tren Maya was built going through there. So, I mean, the hope, the bright side, the silver lining, we're hoping more folks will be able to come learn about ancient Maya civilization and visit sites on their own as a result of the Tren Maya. But in the meantime, the it's not great what's happening with these really rapid construction projects. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you. All right. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Seligson? Feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up. We're still looking at your screen, but I think, oh, there we go. Now we can kind of get a larger view. See if we've got a question.
Yeah, yeah, thanks, Isabel. It's a question. A question about jade curation. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks for asking about that. So it's really tough to know exactly how these jades got to the Puuc. Of course, just because of the stylistic similarities, we think that it passed through the Olmec area, or at least there was some connection there. But of course, originally the jade pieces would have come, or the raw jade material would have come from southeastern Guatemala. So we're thinking that the folks who ended up settling Paso del Macho were bringing this jade with them. Where they came from originally is still up for debate. There are a lot of Ballcourts being built right around this time along the northwestern coast around Merida. Tony Andrews and David Anderson have done a lot of projects up there, identifying dozens of early Ballcourt sites. So we see an immediate connection possibly up there. And we know travel by coast would have been pretty easy compared to potentially traveling overland, even from where Tikal was up to the Puuc. So potentially these folks were coming from around the western coast of Yucatan up to the northwest and then down into the Puuc. But the specific curation of these jade pieces is still something that we're looking into. And another construction project going on, partly related to the Tren Maya, not as much, but the Ruta Puuc sites, Labna, Sayil, Kaba, they're building a Puuc museum at Kaba. They started construction 2 years ago and it has stalled. But in the meantime, they came through all of the archaeological projects in the region and took over curation of a lot of the items that will eventually be in this museum, but are currently whereabouts unknown. So we can no longer study those jades personally. Hopefully there'll be some more work done on them down the road when they're in the museum. But yeah, the smashed ceramics below there, beyond the fact that they really look like they were smashed before they were buried, considering how eroded they were and the small pieces that they were in, even though they were nestled into these small niches in the rock, suggest that it may have been related to some kind of a feasting ceremony that we often see with these kind of consecration rituals. And afterward, you can think of even Thor smashing his mugs, smashing these vessels, and then burying them to consecrate this space. The Kin Tecomate was unfortunately so shattered that we weren't even able to attempt to put it back together, but it would have been a pretty sizable Oya, that one. We do have the pieces. Some of them were not cleaned off so that we can potentially run some paleoethnobotanical analyses on any residues that would have been on the inside. So we're hoping to do that as part of this current project. But yeah, still more to come on those right now. Still kind of sifting through them really. But thanks. Yeah. Yeah, Alexis.
I was wondering if the Ballcourts gave us any insight into Maya cosmology.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I know I'd packed so much into this that I was hoping I'd be able to delve into more during the Q&A. So yeah, we know that the ball game, at least later versions, was connected to warfare on one level, but also creation and connections with death on another level. You know that some classic period ball courts were built to actually be flooded, so you'd have a very low but significant level of water on the surface of the ball courts, and these surfaces of water, of what bodies of water were seen as liminal spaces connecting our world and spiritual realms. And so all those ideas out there about ball players being sacrificed, whether they won or lost, that's definitely exaggerated. But there was an element of death involved, and these were seen as warriors competing in this game. We have depictions of elites participating in the game. We know that when dignitaries would visit neighboring sites or other sites, the ball games would be part of these welcoming ceremonies. So another aspect of the ball courts, at least at Paso del Macho and Xanab Chak, that we think might be linked with cosmological concerns is their orientation. So you may have noticed they were not oriented specifically north-south. The one at Xanab Chak is about 9 or 10 degrees east of north, and the one at Paso del Macho is 12 degrees east of north, and those are not accidents. I mean, the Maya people who built these communities knew what we would consider as true north or direct north. So they were purposely built at these angles. Some ball courts in other parts of Mesoamerica are built at those angles specifically to mark the passage of the sun over the course of the year, almost like E-groups that you may have heard about at other Maya sites that are used specifically to track where the solstice and the equinoxes are going to occur over the course of the year. Ball courts also could have been used for these purposes, and that's why we sometimes see offerings buried in the center that mimic a planted maize field. These are connected with agriculture on some level as well. In the Puuc region, we don't see many E-groups, partly because we have so many hills that these natural features could have served as these viewing platforms and points to mark the passage of the sun over the course of the year. But yeah, there's definitely these ritual and cosmological concerns connected to the ball courts in the Puuc as anywhere else. And the ball game itself would have been also part of these rituals. Thanks. Yeah, Kata.
I can let the other person ask the question first because I think mine will be maybe connecting to your book.
Oh, okay. Yeah, shameless plug there at the end. Couldn't help myself. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is also more related to, I think, your book, because you mentioned at the beginning the name of this wasp, and I know that the Maya people have been keeping stingless bees and other similarly very closely related hymenopterans, and I was curious if that was something that you had looked at, and if so, how that connects to everything.
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. So yeah, apiaries, beekeeping were definitely a big part of Maya life. We know during the classic period, and just based on deductions from that backwards, we can only assume that practices go back to this time period, if not earlier. In terms of archaeological correlates, the main thing that folks are finding from the classic period and early post-classic period are the tapas, the little discs made of ceramic or stone that would have covered the human-made or human-modified beehives. So we know that the hollowed out trunks that they would use, sometimes they'd actually make trunks out of ceramic to house bee colonies, and they'd cover them with these little tapas. And they found those at sites like Mayapan, which is not too far from where we work out on the northern plains. We have not found any, unfortunately, at our sites, but the exciting thing is that these next 2 years, our excavations at Xanab Chak are going to focus specifically on the residences. Definitely not glamorous, these little mounds, but they're going to give us a lot more specific data about the day-to-day lives of individuals. So we will definitely be on the lookout for those little round tapas that would have potentially covered these artificial hives or natural hives. But yeah, we think that, I mean, honey would have been a part of the diet for sure. And today there are apiaries all around where we're working in that region. Unfortunately, theft of apiaries is an issue to the point where the guys who work near where we're working put up a gate with a bunch of locks on the road to our site to protect their apiaries. And it's only about a 1.5 kilometer walk for us, which isn't that bad, but it's makes it that much harder to get to our site. But I mean, unfortunate that apiary theft is a thing. But yeah, today, unfortunately, a lot of the apiaries in our area are African or European honeybees. As you probably know, the Melipona, the native species, were largely outcompeted by these other species after the Spanish invasion. They are bringing back Melipona more and more in northern Yucatan today, which is great. But yeah, where we are, it's these stinging bees. The Melipona species are mainly stingless, but our bees are stinging, so we try to avoid the apiaries as much as possible.
Yeah, so I would like to connect to the title of your book and also to the talk of Anna Belfort, who unfortunately had to leave for some medical appointment. And I'm sure she would be asking this question if she were here. You know, what are your thoughts? And of course, everybody after this lecture is going to want to read your book. But if you could give us a little tiny bit of a spoiler here, what are your thoughts about the famous Maya collapse and the relationship of the collapse with the drought and climate change, you know, making a little tiny bit of a preview of that book that we will read.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Also be happy to give a talk in the spring lecture series about that. The speakers lineup. But yeah, it's a huge topic. But I will say, first of all, that just even the word collapse can definitely be misconstrued depending on, you have to be very specific about what you're talking about, which is one of the things that I'm focusing on in the book. Just because if you think about collapse, you're thinking about complete destruction, sudden event. And depending on what time scale you're looking at, like, yeah, that what happened at the end of the Maya Classic period was definitely a massive transformation. And we do have examples of some sites that were abandoned in a day or two based on an attack or some kind of complete internal dysfunction. But for the most part, we're looking at a process that occurred over 200, 250 years. So if like we look at the life of the United States, we're approaching 250 years as an independent nation. So if we look at that time scale, it was definitely not a sudden thing. We're talking about many generations. But we can't get away from the fact that there were these environmental changes going on. We can see through many lines of archaeometric data that there were mega droughts that were affecting certain regions. But that's another thing. They weren't affecting the whole Maya lowlands uniformly. Even today, you can be in one valley and there'll be massive rainfalls and it'll be completely dry 15 kilometers away. So over the course of decades, these weather patterns were affecting regions differentially. But over the course of decades and centuries, we do see this drying period punctuated by massive superstorms that would not have helped matters. We know that around 800, early 800s CE, a lot of the southern Maya sites in Guatemala and Belize start to be depopulated. We can only assume, we don't have too much direct data, but we can assume that a lot of folks would have fled these sites northward, part of the reason why we see a massive population boom in the Puuc region around that time is due to local growth, but also people coming in as migrants from other regions. And that's a whole other talk, but they took measures to protect their resources in the Puuc, recognizing that there were folks coming in and they were going to have to change how they did things, like how they made lime, for instance, burnt lime. They changed their approach to be more fuel conserving, and they were able to absorb these massive populations and hold out in the face of these droughts that much longer than farther to the south. And I mean, again, getting back to the idea of collapse as being this all-encompassing destructive thing, the political system that was in place in the classic period that had divine rulers that oversaw the construction of these massive pyramids and temples, that did change. We don't see references to these divine rulers entering into the post-classic period. We see a reorganization of socio-political things, but we see the continuation of language, continuation of writing all the way through the Spanish invasion, continuation of religious practices, culinary practices, traditional ecological knowledge. So that's what I'm just worried about out there in the public imagination, the popular imagination, when we talk about collapse and people think, oh, the Maya disappeared. And that's why people ask, oh, what happened to the Maya? And we have to say, nothing happened to the Maya. The Maya are alive and well. Their living legacy is here today for us. But people tend to focus on ancient civilizations disappearing. So there are definitely aspects of the classic Maya society that transformed and were not continued into the post-classic and then the post-invasion period. But there are many other aspects that do survive, as we all know, and continue to the present. So that's what I was trying to focus on in the book, more so the continuation of practices and kind of rethinking this idea of collapse. And of course, climate change as a parallel to today, different causes for sure, maybe different degrees, but still people adapted. They knew that they were going to be changing things up. People moved away from these large cities to smaller villages, smaller communities, and continued. And it wasn't just like, it wasn't like another Marvel reference. It wasn't like Thanos snapped his fingers and half the population disappeared. People moved away from the cities to smaller villages that we can't see as easily in the archaeological record, but they didn't all just disappear. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
Ken, if I could just ask a quick question. I know that we're sort of running out of time. In fact, we can stay as long as we like, but I would just let everybody know it's 14. So if you'd like to leave. But I have a question for you about the Ballcourts, because you spoke about the cosmological dimension, and then you started to talk about the social dimension more and the eliteness that they can be associated with in terms of like hosting visitors. But when you put them in this context of kind of smaller agricultural communities, I can't help but wonder about how do they associate with changing concepts of status with local leadership institutions, or are they separate from that at that time? Are they purely sort of cosmological? Can you speak to that, the social dimensions of the Ballcourts?
Oh yeah, I mean that's such a super interesting topic. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I just wish I could speak more concretely about it. The thing about these really early sites, when we're dealing with absolutely no epigraphy from these sites, as far as we know, no writing, and very limited iconography that we have so far, we're really just basing our inferences about the Ballcourt and how it was used socially on what was going on later in the classic period and working backwards. But yeah, the fact that we're seeing these Ballcourts show up at these really tiny sites, even Paso del Macho, if you talk about 80 household mounds, maybe not all of them were occupied at the same time. So we're talking about population in the low hundreds, if that. And then at Chak, maybe 500 to 1,000 people. Very rough estimate, don't run too much of that. But yeah, these small communities, the Ballcourt was there when they built it. It was there. They'd use it for important events for sure. We don't know if there was like a Eastern Puuc ball game league where people would come from other sites with Ballcourts and play against the Xanab Chak team, that kind of stuff. But it would have been used. It would have been there on the landscape. You can imagine kids getting a rubber ball playing after school. on this ball court when it wasn't being used for official events. Probably, honestly, the limiting factor for the use of the ball game would have been access to the rubber balls themselves, which would have all been coming from Veracruz. And they're durable, they're made out of rubber, but they wouldn't have lasted forever, probably. So possibly the limiting factor would have been that. But it would have been a center point of the community. As far as civic architecture at Xanab goes, you have the central platform, the central plaza just to the west, which we also excavated a little bit this past summer, and I managed to restrain myself from including an extra 20 minutes in this already long talk about that. But that and the ball court. And so if this was the central focus of the community, you could imagine that it was used for these community solidarity events, reinforcing your identity as Xanab Chaqueños. There are even smaller villages around Xanab and Paso del Macho that we don't have no evidence of. It's just these house mounds that don't show up in the LiDAR. So you can imagine folks would be coming from a day's walk away, maybe even sometimes 2 days walk away, to events that would have been occurring here. So it would have, I mean, this is how I think of it, at least, as this feature of Xanab that would have made it appealing for other folks to come here for market days, for important events throughout the calendar year. But yeah, really, really interesting to think about as this unifying force.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you have a few more minutes to stay with us. It looks like Fernanda has a question. Okay.
Hello, thank you for coming. I'm so glad to have you here and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing, which is great. Also, congratulations on your book. That's awesome. Actually, I have two questions. One, when you showed the figurines, I automatically thought Tlatilco. They were very similar.
Yes.
Very too. So I'm like, wait. They look very familiar. Especially the eye shape and the head. That's definitely like the most characteristic factors. I don't know if you considered them as well. I know you had Veracruz up there and other early sites too, but in central Mexico. But I don't know. I saw more of a similarity with Tlatilco than with some of the others that you put up there. So I wonder if that's like, a comparative source or anything.
Yeah, that's a great eye that you have for that. Having worked personally with those Tlatilco figurines, I know you did. You can recognize them firsthand. But yeah, the face especially has some similarities. And the bodies seem to be a bit different from your average Tlatilco figurine for sure. But it's also interesting because the Tlatilco figurines are dating a little earlier, like 1300, 1200 BCE, so early pre-classic, and then this we're tentatively dating to the late middle pre-classic, so possibly 500 years after the Tlatilco figurines. But yeah, I definitely was looking at those as well. I was looking everywhere to see some kind of thing that'll be like, that's it, that's where it comes from, that's the idea. But what it shows is that all these different areas were in contact with each other. People knew what was going on elsewhere, and then they put their own spin on things, which is super cool. But we're just happy to be able to show through these finds of the figurine, the jades, that the northern Yucatan, the Puuc region especially, was tied in with these broader networks. It wasn't just a backwater that people settled in later. All this whole area was connected with each other, with these trade networks, with basalt, with figurines, with jade. So yeah, but yeah, definitely the Tlatilco connection was pretty stunning. So yeah, thanks for noticing that.
If I could just quickly follow up, I was thinking exactly the same thing, and I didn't want to make my question too long. But I'm so glad you mentioned it, Fernanda, because I was thinking about your work with the LACMA exhibit of the figurines, and what came to mind. I don't know if you worked on the so-called pretty lady figurines from Tlatilco, but they have sort of carved out eyes. So the whole eye is carved out, but then the central part of it is almost like an hourglass shape. So it seemed to me when I saw your figurine that it could be kind of a shorthand for that, like a quick way to accomplish the same shape without doing the careful carving that we see in most of the Tlatilco examples that are well known.
Yeah.
But I thought, I went to the same place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I've talked to a bunch of folks who are more familiar with figurines than I am, and that's what they said as well. Like sometimes they purposely have the eyes be a little misaligned to perhaps capture an individual's portrait, someone whose eyes were a little misaligned, or maybe it's connected with a certain state that they were in or the figurine was supposed to be in. But yeah, just the fact that the left indentations were so misaligned, that was what was throwing me for a while. But everyone was like, no, they're just sclera, and you can see the double punch technique in central Mexico on the Pacific coast of Guatemala. So simpler,
Yeah.
less exciting, but definitely simpler and more believable explanation for what we're seeing there.
There is a question in the chat if you'll hang out with us for just a bit longer.
Oh, yeah.
And if you need to go, let us know. I
No,
don't mean to
I'm
keep
fine.
you. You okay?
Awesome.
Okay. Samuel has a question. It says, can you quickly expand on how have humans impacted their environment and how do environments affect human societies in the region you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a great
Quick expansion.
question. Yeah, I can speak a little bit about that for sure. I mean, we know that these folks that were building Paso del Macho and Chak were farming. They were, I mean, maize would have been a central part of that, but also dozens of other species would have been domesticated or on their way to domestication at that point. So they would have been altering the landscape, perhaps not as much as modern agriculture does. But mimicking natural growing patterns. We know, of course, the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, were grown in a similar way to how they might grow naturally, feeding off each other, feeding each other. So as populations grew, once people settled down, we know that there would have been clearing more and more land for agricultural purposes. So that naturally, or that definitely would have necessitated changing the environment a little bit, less forests, more cleared areas, but a rotational system where you farm an area for 7 to 10 years and then let it go fallow for 20 years or so and then come back to it would have presumably at least kept more of a balance and sustainability factor. But we know that towards the end of the pre-classic period, and possibly actually a little earlier in the Puuc region, because we don't have many sites dating to the late pre-classic period in our region, combined with climate change during that time, less reliable rainfall, we see a lot of larger sites depopulated at the end of the pre-classic, and that's why we have this distinction between the pre-classic period and the classic period. There was this kind of downturn in large central communities, and then growth again during the classic period. And part of the reason we think is because populations were getting so large that they were clearing so much land around some of the larger sites like El Mirador that I mentioned in northern Guatemala. In that region, they had been relying on these lakes to supply the city with water. And then they started to clear the hills around El Mirador to farm. And by clearing the trees, they cleared the roots that would have held all the soil onto the hillsides. And so we see this layer of what they call Maya clay in the center of what are now bajos or swamps that only fill with water seasonally. They would have been perennial lakes leading into the late pre-classic period, but then they were filled in every time it rained. It would have flooded all this soil down from the hillsides into the lakes and turning them into swamps. So we do see that level of human intervention in the environment to a negative way in some areas where you have really large groups of people living. But we also see on the flip side, folks learning from kind of those early trials and errors during the classic period. You also have periods of instability with climate change and less rainfall than expected. And so you see folks adapting. You see sites like Caracol in Western Belize, massive site. They think that this extended metropolis or metropolitan area may have had 100,000 people at some point. Every single square inch of land was terraced, not just to provide farming areas, but to protect from erosion, from rainfall on the hillsides, keep the soil there. So people learned over time. And the fact that the classic period lasts 700, 800 years in a tropical environment with variable climate and rainfall is pretty impressive when we think about it. I mean, it's more impressive than the fact that you have this transformational period at the end of the classic period. The folks were able to learn so much about their environment that they're able to modify it to a degree, but also to in a sustainable way in a lot of places. And so how do environments affect human societies? Well, we know that a lot of the way that people understood the world around them was based on what they were seeing in the natural environment around them. And so we see local traditions, culinary, medicinal, construction activities based on the knowledge that was accumulated over generations. Before we even see any archaeological remains, people were already working with and altering the forests around them. I mean, we see today the Maya forests in central Yucatan, Guatemala. People tend to think of them as these pristine primordial forests, but everything has been shaped by humans. And I think Annabelle Ford was talking about this as well. Like all the trees around these Maya sites are the result of people selecting certain trees that are good for hardware purposes, firing purposes, medicinal purposes, food purposes. And then after thousands of years, they spread, but we see these clusters of really functional species around archaeological sites. And that's not a coincidence. People have been altering and working within their environments and altered by them for such a long time. Yeah, it's just all intertwined. It's a great question.
Thank you so much, Ken. We really appreciate your time and the expertise that you've shared with us and your knowledge about this area. I'm going to give you an applause. Mine is vocal, audible.
Speaking with for so long, I know. Once I get started, got so much I want to talk about.
I think it's great. Thanks for taking the time with us. If you'll hang out for a minute, I'll chat with you for a bit longer, just to catch up. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon and a great weekend.